Welcome back to the Solution Series brought to you by DoubleRadius. In the WISP world today, we are constantly talking about the BDC, FCC Form 477, and the changes to the NTIA BEAD program. So we actually sat down and interviewed and talked to a trusted source in the industry, and we wanted to share this information with you and hope it's valuable. Please welcome Steve Coran.
This presentation is not intended to create an attorney-client relationship. The information contained in this presentation is general and is not offered as legal advice. You are strongly encouraged to consult with your attorney if you have specific questions, and any reliance on the information in this presentation is taken at your own risk.
So welcome, Steve. I'm glad you're able to join us today for this first solution series that's not product or hardware, tied to any hardware. So we're glad you could join us today. Can you just do a quick little introduction of yourself and where you're at?
Sure. My name's Steve Coran. I'm an attorney at Lerman Center in Washington, D.C. For the last 15 plus years, I've been representing WISPA, the Trade Association for Wireless ISPs, in addition to servicing clients who are broadband providers for all technologies, everything from funding programs such as CAF and RDOF and BEAD, as well as M&A work, transactional work, licensing, enforcement, you name it. I'm very fortunate to have a lot of talented people around me who can't make me look good, but can make me look better. So that's a little bit about who I am.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you. Well, maybe we can just jump right into it because you mentioned it. There's been a lot of discussion, especially in the WISPA community, about the broadband equity, access and development funding, or BEAD for short, and all the new, I guess, requirements that are coming about that WISP in particular that we mostly at DoubleRadius deal with are having to, figure out seemingly maybe a little bit on their own, but reaching out, I think, to you, they're reaching out to distributors like us, and even on the radio manufacturer side, they're reaching out to them. Can you kind of do a brief introduction of BEAD and then now the new Form 477 and those requirements, and then the broadband data collection? How are all those three things intertwined?
So let me start with kind of a high level on the BEAD program that NTIA is putting together. It's $42.45 billion that will be made available through a federal program, but distributed by each of the states that have decided to participate, and all of them have. So all the states and the territories will be have indicated that they want access to this federal funding to promote broadband service. The program will be kind of implemented, I would think late 2020. Well, it'll be implemented between now and then. There's a lot of hoops that states and others need to go through, and we'll talk about some of those. But the money won't start flowing until probably late 2023 or early 2024. That's my best guesstimate now. That's because, to your point, Katie, the FCC and NTIA, the FCC is creating the broadband map that NTIA will rely on when they identify, and the states identify, what areas will be treated as unserved and what areas will be treated as underserved, and therefore be available for this funding. So the process that folks are really focused on right now is the broadband data collection, BDC, that the FCC is implementing alongside for at least this cycle, Form 477. So between now and September 1, all broadband providers will be filing Form 477 and also the new BDC submission that goes through the FCC's portal and is filed electronically. That is to design the areas where broadband providers self-report where they offer broadband service, whether it's fiber or fixed wireless or some other technology. So very important for folks to participate, because if you do want to participate in the BEAD program, timely submission of Form 477 and timely submission of BDC information is a prerequisite to even applying for that funding. So if you don't do that, you're not going to be eligible for the funding. We'll talk about whether funding is a good thing or a bad thing, and how do you play defense, how do you play offense, how do you play special teams. But let me stop there and take your follow-up question.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask Steve, a lot of the confusion seems to be on some of the key dates. And I know you mentioned September 1st. So what are the next couple key dates that our customers or providers need to know about? Obviously September 1st, but then what other ones coming up do they need to be aware of?
So the Form 477 and the BDC deadlines are the same as they've always been for Form 477. So the September 1 deadline is to report information as of the end of June. At the end of December is another kind of reporting period ending, and those reports will be due on March 1st, before March 1st. And once again, it'll be the BDC and Form 477 on March 1st for information as of December 31. And then so on and so forth. Every 6 months, you'll be reporting that information. Do think there will be some changes as we go forward here on the way the FCC collects information. They're also putting out FAQs from time to time. So if folks do have questions on certain BDC submission information as well as Form 477 information, you can ask the FCC through a drop-down menu on the web page, and they'll answer your question or get back to you or post an FAQ for all to see.
So Steve, if they have an intent to complete, like they're going to fill out their Form 77 by what they actually have rolled out as of June, or what they are going to roll out between now and the end of the year?
So the information needs to be current as of that June 30th date and reflect where you offer service or where you can deploy service within 10 days without an extraordinary expenditure of expense, without extraordinary expense.
Okay.
So that's the standard that is used for Form 477 and that they're using for the BDC. The one thing we don't know is, for purposes of the BEAD program, well, let me go back a little bit. Your submissions, as well as the broadband fabric that is being created separately to identify serviceable locations, will be subject to a challenge process. So it's important to file as accurately and, of course, timely, with the understanding that the information you submit to the FCC, as well as the broadband map, will be subject to challenge from community officials, potential customers that have been denied service. You're going to have a chance to challenge the fabric because it may not include all the areas that you can cover. And from that, that will all get kind of sorted out, and we'll have a, quote, final map. Now, obviously, there's no such thing as a final map because it's evolving all the time. You're building out service, houses are being torn down, new ones are going up. So it becomes a very sort of dynamic process as we go forward. What we don't know is which map the states will be using, and they're supposed to go through a challenge process too, when it kind of sets the locations and then decides how much money they are going to be able to deploy and what their process is going to be. So there's a multi-step process. We don't know the exact timelines for any of this, but I've heard that October may be, we may be ready to go through the first challenge process. What I hope is that we don't have what I refer to as the map gap, which is where your information goes in on September 1 of 2022, and someone in 2024 decides that we're going to use that map to make our funding decision, because it won't be current and it won't be accurate and it won't be granular. So getting the final map as close to the funding decisions is real important. One thing that may constrain that is that NTIA needs to know how much money to give each state, and that's going to be based on what their locations are. So hopefully, with everything moving in parallel, we won't have a large map gap.
What about one of the requirements on the Form 477 that it seems like a lot of WISP are, maybe not up in arms, but very confused about is, having a PE sign off or PE certification sign
Yeah,
off on the data.
right. So that is for not Form 477. That is only for the broadband data
Okay.
collection. So for Form 477, you do need a corporate officer to sign. For the BDC program, you need not just a corporate officer, but either a certified professional engineer licensed by the state or a corporate engineering officer employed by the provider who has direct knowledge of or responsibility for generating the BDC filing. So a bunch of associations, CCA being the lead, filed with the FCC and said, there are not very many certified professional engineers out there. And by the way, why do you need a certified licensed professional engineer to sign off on a map? They're not building towers or putting pipes in the ground or building sewage systems. They're really just looking at a map, in which case, why do you need a professional engineer, which is primarily for safety, to sign off on these? So the FCC made some decisions in a waiver order that came out a couple of weeks ago to kind of say, well, here's the clarification on the rule. You need to be either a professional engineer or you need to be a corporate engineering officer. If you can't meet any of those requirements, then we're going to grant a limited waiver. And this will apply to the first 3 BDC filing cycles. So the data as of June 30, 2022, that's the one that has to be uploaded by September 1. And then the next the next 2 cycles ending December 31, 2022 and June 30, 2023. And the waiver is to provide sufficient time for providers to become accustomed to filing the data in the BDC system and obtain necessary engineering support. So what does the waiver allow you to do based on kind of what's going on is you have 2 different ways that you can qualify for the engineering waiver. One is the engineer must possess a bachelor's or postgraduate degree in electrical engineering, electronic technology, or another similar technical discipline, and at least 7 years of relevant experience in broadband network design and/or performance. So that's the first waiver. The second one is probably the one that most wireless ISPs will want to take advantage of, and that's where the engineer has to possess specialized training, in other words, not a college degree, relevant to broadband network engineering and design, deployment, and performance, and at least 10 years, instead of 7, of relevant experience in broadband network engineering, design, and/or performance. And the FCC was convinced that these were ways that most filers for these first 3 cycles would be able to qualify for the waiver. And if you do want to take advantage of the waiver, you go into the BDC portal. There should be a drop down that says explanations and comments, and then you include the following language, which is the engineer certifying our submission meets the minimum qualifications outlined in the declaratory ruling and limited waiver adopted on July 8, 2022 in WC docket number 19-195. So if you're a WISPA member, we did a webinar on this a few weeks ago, and you can go and look at this in more detail. That webinar was done on July 13th, just 5 days after the order came out. So more detail there, or contact me offline if you have questions about the waiver or about the certification process.
Do you think that this is, a service distributors could offer or integrators could offer if they have someone on staff that has their 10+ years experience, designing, going out on site, doing installs?
One of the thing that's pretty clear is that for purposes of the waiver, the engineer does not need to be an employee. So if there is somebody who meets those qualifications of specialized training and 10+ years of experience, then and they've looked at the information, then the provider could go ahead and make that certification in the waiver request. So I do think that there are companies that hopefully will offer professional engineering services, because then you don't need the waiver, you just have the PE sign off on it. I don't know what their charges are, but I know there are some companies out there offering that. There may be vendors or other consultants that could set up a program to work with providers to offer either the PE certification or one of the waiver certifications. Probably not a corporate engineering officer, since they're not an officer of the company.
Right, okay.
Steve, if we can take a little bit of a step back, what led to the BDC? How did we get to where we are today? Because a lot of customers say, hey, we've been doing the same thing for 15, 20 years, why now, right? So what brought us to the point where the BDC became a necessity?
Because broadband maps suck. That would be the first thing, and everybody realized that, including Congress. So this is congressional action, not the FCC, as a way to promote greater accuracy and granularity in reporting of where broadband is available and where it isn't. And that's for purposes of determining where funding should be provided. So Congress appropriated a lot of money for this. Well, a lot of money to me and you, to put the map in place, and is providing technical support, and therefore it's important. It's required by Congress, and the FCC has implemented the program in order to make sure that money goes to the right place. It's really important for providers to comply, because if they don't, they're subject to sanctions, forfeitures, fines, things like that. It doesn't help advocacy when you go to the FCC to ask for something, but more importantly, you're more likely to get overbuilt. In fact, you will get overbuilt by federal funding if your coverage area is not accurately reported.
Steve, you think the challenge process is going to be fair to smaller service providers and not just get overwhelmed by the larger ones?
It'll be fair so long as the information that goes in is accurate, and as long as people are diligent and participate. So sure, larger companies have more resources, but smaller companies probably will have less to look at. So and the FCC will be providing some form of technical assistance. Not quite sure what that looks like, but there's lots of information on the FCC's website: videos, tutorials, walkthroughs of what the data specifications are and how to fill it out. So there's a lot of data there, and I'm sure there will be some people that decide that they don't want to do this, and they do so at their own peril.
But just to plug you a little bit, that's the service you can provide to them as well, right?
Certainly we can help them answer questions when it comes to filling out the form and dealing with the challenge process. Absolutely, we can help them with that. I think it'll be designed where it'll all be sort of online. It won't be like filing written filings, but I think there are certain things that that we could work with folks and come up with kind of good answers to the questions when they're challenged. Or if there are no good answers, then deal with that. So it's all going to be very fact-based, and the FCC will look at what they get in. So if they get good data, that'll be great. If they get bad data and bad answers, then we have to deal with that as well.
Outside of being overbuilt, which obviously is a huge determining factor, but what other consequences could an operator possibly run into? Is there fines? Is there any type of, what else besides just, hey, someone can come in and overbuild you, could they run into?
Yeah, you're gonna face FCC enforcement action if A, you don't file, B, there are material errors in what you submit. So something in purple crayon is probably not going to go over very well. And then there's an obligation to update your data. And if you don't update your data, you could be subject to fines for that as well. So There was a hammer and a stick here. The hammer, or carrot and a stick, sorry. The carrot is you can avoid a lot of things and you can protect yourself if you submit the data accurately and in the way the FCC wants to and as completely and thoroughly as you can. And the stick is if you don't, not only you're hurting yourself, but you're going to be subject to FCC enforcement.
What about kind of talk through the change that the FCC made with now considering CBRS as licensed to be able to get the funding, but a lot of ISPs for the majority of their networks are unlicensed. How should operators go about that? Should they just throw up some, CBRS so they can be able to be considered for the funding? Is that, what would be the best approach for a lot of these operators who are mostly deploying, 5 gig right now?
So there are two technology codes that would apply to fixed wireless. One is code 70, which is unlicensed service at a location, and the other is licensed, and that's code 71. Code 71 now includes CBRS GAA. So if you are serving a location with CBRS GAA or any other licensed service like 2.5 or a millimeter wave or something like that, or in combination with unlicensed as kind of a hybrid. So if you have a 5 gigahertz and you also have GAA at the same tower and the location can get both, or if you're a fiber provider and you have fiber and fixed wireless at the same location, then you report all of that. As you kind of alluded to, Katie, the FCC changed CBRS GAA from unlicensed and put it on code 70 and is now including that in code 71 as something called license by rule because it is a licensed service. So if you are providing CBRS, if you were providing GAA service as of June 30, 2022, then you should go ahead and report that you were able to provide service as of that date using CBRS and use code 71. If you put up something now, it won't help you with respect to the filing that's due on September 1 because that had a June 30 snapshot date. But if you still have that in place as of December 30 of this year, then go ahead and report it on the next BDC filing, which is due on March 1st.
And I guess maybe to kind of follow up on that, there's the rule that things have to be in there as far as reliable service. So does having a licensed link, 6 gigahertz or 11 gigahertz from point A to point B, is that considered reliable, or does it have to be extended beyond just that?
So what you're referring to is something that's in the NTIA BEAD program. And the BEAD program says that if you are providing reliable broadband service, then at a particular location, then that location is treated as served and will not be available for BEAD program funding. However, what NTIA said was that service that is provided entirely over unlicensed spectrum is not reliable broadband service. So what NTIA said is that reliable broadband service must be a fixed broadband service that is available with a high degree of certainty, both at the present and the foreseeable future. So they've included fiber optic technology, cable modem / hybrid fiber coax tech, DSL, or, as I said, terrestrial fixed wireless technology utilizing entirely licensed spectrum or a hybrid of licensed and unlicensed spectrum. And that generally will direct you back to the two FCC technology codes that I talked about. So so if you are providing service at a location with unlicensed fixed wireless spectrum, then that is eligible to be unserved or underserved for purposes of BEAD program funding. So that's obviously not an outcome that favors a lot of WISPs that are only using fixed wireless at the location. So what we've been able to determine from the FCC, which is not 1,000% clear, is what is meant by entirely. Does entirely mean only, which means it's a last mile interpretation? What does the customer receive at that location? If they're only getting it off a 5 gigahertz link, point to multi-point 5 gigahertz tower, is that, and that's the only way that they are getting their broadband service through the last mile. Does that mean that it's unlicensed and not reliable broadband service? So the answer that we've been able to get from the FCC is yes, regardless of whether you have a fiber backhaul or a point-to-point 11 gigahertz or 18 gigahertz or 6 gigahertz link. The opposite would be true if you have an unlicensed point-to-point link going to a tower, but then you have, for instance, 2.5 licensed service going to the customer's location. And because the FCC seems to be looking at this from what is available at the location and only the last mile service, anything further up the chain does not factor in. So another way to say this, long-winded way of saying this, is that when you see the word entirely, we think that the FCC is interpreting this to mean only. So if the only way that the customer gets your service is through an unlicensed connection to whatever happens to be upstream, then you would be code 70, you would be unlicensed broadband service, and you would be subject to overbuilding under the BEAD program because they would not treat that as reliable broadband service. Now, you may have seen that WISPA put out, has had some engagement with NTIA, and WISPA's new president and CEO, I think over the weekend or yesterday, posted a LinkedIn discussion of what WISPA's position is on this. So if you go to David Zumwalt or WISPA, I'm not sure where it was posted on LinkedIn, you can see kind of a long discussion about WISPA's position here as to why, the 9 million customers with low churn who are receiving broadband service, many of those over an unlicensed connection, do not believe that they are that it is unreliable. And there's a lot of other technical arguments that we can add to that too, with respect to the way that unlicensed is architected and configured in a network, and in some cases may even be better than licensed service because you have more spectrum to be frequency agile over, beamforming technologies, a lot of different things that are used now that strongly suggest that unlicensed spectrum will be around for a while. And in fact, there's 850 megahertz of pretty clean 6 gigahertz spectrum in rural areas that hasn't even been deployed yet or isn't even commercially available yet. And that's something that I think NTIA needs to hear about. So we're hopeful, if not optimistic, that NTIA may change its mind and reconsider. We'll see where that goes.
But as we stand today, the new spectrum in 6 gigahertz would still be considered unlicensed, correct?
Yeah, it is an unlicensed service. It's Part 15. It may use an AFC, but the AFC, the automated frequency control, is not there to provide interference protection. It's there to ensure that incumbents don't get interference. So the incumbents being point-to-point links that are used by public safety, CII, critical information, as well as a lot of WISP for their backhaul.
Speaking of the AFC, oh, go here.
No, you go ahead.
No, I was gonna just do you think any feedback on a time frame for the FCC to finally roll out the AFC for 6 gig?
So I know they're still working on that in the multi-stakeholder group. I don't have too much visibility into what they're doing, but I I understand that they're moving forward, so hopefully it won't be too much longer. I know that's not a very good estimate when I say not too much longer, but that's as good as I can do. I'm not sort of in the weeds on that, and there's a lot of stakeholders, and it's a big process. So that's where we are.
I think in this industry, everybody's okay with soon. It's the buzzword I think everybody goes with.
Well, I think I said not too much longer, which is maybe a different, it might mean something different than soon. So I'll give myself as many
It's all
outs as I
relative.
can on
It's
that.
all
Yeah,
relative.
right.
Do you
Steve, this
think,
has really been helpful for all of us.
Yeah.
Katie, do you have another question?
no, go ahead.
Well, what I was wondering through the NTIA, is it a fight to help them understand the technology, or is it from the unlicensed side, or are they pretty open for the technical conversations?
Well, I don't want to get into too much inside baseball, but I would say that they seem, at the outset disinclined to change anything for this program. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. They were required to coordinate with the FCC on the definition of reliable broadband service. From what we understand, there were discussions. There were also discussions with folks at OMB and the White House. And this comes back way up top as to why BEAD is different than CAF and RDOF. And one of the primary reasons is that the Department of Commerce and NTIA is an executive agency, which means that the White House can have influence. FCC is an independent agency, and there's not supposed to be that level of influence from cabinet level or the White House on those sorts of things. So this is a political shift from the way that we've done reverse auctions in CAF and RDOF to the way that states will likely be allocating BEAD funds. Although I have heard that Nebraska has adopted a reverse auction, at least for their current ongoing program. So that's kind of the answer here. I think there were some things that they knew, and when we presented them with a lot of technical information, some things that they didn't know. And I think their concern was, well, there's no guarantee that the spectrum is going to be available in 5 years or 10 years. And we're like, we've got 850 megahertz just sitting there that isn't even available yet, but we know it will be. And when was the last time the FCC took away unlicensed spectrum? Quite the contrary. They're continuing to put more and more out there to support, Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 7, IoT, rural broadband, a whole host of things. So my personal opinion is that this was a political decision that was made by folks in the White House, and they charted their own path, very different from the FCC, which had no problem accepting unlicensed spectrum for purposes of CAF and RDOF, and even 6 gigahertz for the RDOF program.
Does it make it any risk, being a political kind of driven process, that potentially, and I don't want us to get too political, but the question is, if there is a change in the White House or the cabinet, does that impact the viability of this program?
It could force some changes. We'll see where we are in 2024. I mean, if the money's already going out the door at 2024, it's going to be hard to reverse that, right? So, and I don't think, hard to say if the midterms would change much. There are folks in Congress that are very interested in the overbuilding issue. They tend to be Republicans, because the Democrats really don't want to undermine the White House and undermine the Democratic administration that's in place at NTIA. That's just sort of a political fact that probably doesn't need to be stated, but that's where we are. So if the House flips and the Senate flips, is their influence going to change? Probably so. Will it result in changes in will it result in changes in legislation that will override a political, a presidential veto? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. That makes sense.
But as we like to say that elections have consequences, and they do. I would also add to that for the BEAD program, COVID has consequences, because I doubt very much that there'd be $42.45 billion available for broadband if we didn't have COVID over the last couple of years. So I don't know what the number would have been, maybe zero, but somewhere between 0 and $42 billion.
Just a little stretch there.
Yeah, real money, real taxpayer money.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing that's unique about this. This is being funded through appropriations and not through contributions into the Universal Service Fund. So a lot of differences between the way things were done before. I like to say that with BEAD, there's the good, the bad, and the uncertain. One of the uncertainties we talked about before was the map gap. Another one is how are the states going to distribute the money? About half of them have broadband programs in place already, and some of those do a good job, and some, in my personal opinion, not so much. But the other ones have not even stood up a program yet. So, and we don't know what that's going to look like. So hopefully they will get good advice from consultants and people like us who, and this is where we talk about, special teams, and that is where, get in and meet the folks who will be making those decisions in the governor's office, the broadband office, the State Department of Commerce, who's ever responsible for doling out the money. Get them to know you if you're an ISP and you're interested in this. We talked about playing defense. That's, making sure that the map accurately projects what you have. And then there's the whole thing about playing offense. What if I want to go after the money? And in that respect, I would just say make sure you read through the BEAD rules very, very carefully, because another thing I like to say is BEAD is not a broadband program. It's a Roosevelt era public works program. It involves things like prevailing wages, like having sustainable low income programs, not for the life of the program, but for the life of the network assets. That could be as long as 20 years. You have to have that program in place. It's a 25% letter of credit that you have to post, 25% of the value of what you're getting, which means you have to be prepared to not just deal with that, but if you have to put up cash collateral equal to the amount, that's money that you have to have that's just going to sit in the bank to make the bank happy. You won't be able to borrow from that. It's a contingent liability, and then there's going to be ongoing fees with that. There's also, you have to have a cybersecurity plan and a supply chain plan. There's a whole, you have to, for any program above $5 million, you have to meet Davis-Bacon wage requirements. There's a whole bunch of ornaments that are put on this tree. And for some, they will look at this and say, my Christmas tree is going to fall over and it's going to set my house on fire, because the costs of this program are so excessive. So all the more reason to focus on defense now. Think about what you want to do for offense, and play the special teams game by talking to the state folks.
That's great advice. Steve, this has really been helpful. I think it gives us a good overview and gives us a good understanding of where we are as an industry. And unless Katie or Benton have any other questions, I think that should do it for the day.
No, I'm good. Thank you, Steve. We appreciate all the insightful, educating us on this, and our customers too. So we
Anytime.
appreciate it.
Happy to help y'all. This presentation is not intended to create an attorney-client relationship. The information contained in this presentation is general and is not offered as legal advice. You are strongly encouraged to consult with your attorney if you have specific questions, and any reliance on the information in this presentation is taken at your own risk.